Okay, well, look, thank you very much indeed for coming out this evening. We're going to look, I think it's fair to say, at pretty momentous things that are happening in the land of Israel that we're all watching anyway all the time, and suddenly bursting onto our screens were just the most astoundingly awful things that were happening in Israel on October the 7th. I was the grand age of 54 2 weeks ago. So I was born in 1969. And during my life, I've got to tell you, I haven't seen events like we're witnessing now in Israel, because I missed the 1967 war by 2 years. Some of you in here, and I'm not being rude to those of you who did see it, but some of you did see it and remember it. But during my life, I haven't, yes, there was the Yom Kippur War in 1973, and I don't remember that because I was 4. So during my memorable life, there hasn't been anything like we're witnessing right now in relation to Israel. There's been conflicts, haven't there, that have sort of bubbled up and disappeared again. There's definitely been that. But somehow, I don't know if you'd agree with me, this somehow feels very different than the other things that we've seen happen over the last, so from the 1980s, 90s into the year 2000s. I've been doing the weekly World Watch now since the year 2003. And when I was looking back through some of the slides all the way back 20 years ago now, nothing is like that's happening now. And also, it isn't just us looking at it, thinking this is a momentous event that's taking place. It's the world seems to think that as well, don't they? The world's on edge about this. And America has sent in its warships, hasn't it, into the Eastern Mediterranean. Britain has also sent warships into the Eastern Mediterranean. Every world leader appears to have something to say about the events that are happening in relation to Israel. Ukraine, which was number 1 on the news for such a long time, has now completely disappeared, and now pretty much every evening when you put the TV on and watch the 10 o'clock news or whatever news you watch, we're live from Jerusalem. We're live from Jerusalem. And then suddenly anti-Semitism has exploded, not only in this country, but all around the world. It's up thousands of % in many instances. And the Jews in this country and many other countries are suddenly scared to go out looking like a Jewish person. The caps have disappeared, they're dressing differently because of the great anti-Semitism that is there. And of course, we've seen on the streets of London hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets. They're not waving the flag of Israel, are they? How many people are waving the flag of Israel? It's pretty much non-existent. But thousands are waving the Palestinian flag, and many, many anti-Semitic phrases and so on are being used. So suddenly the whole world feels on edge with what's going on. And the trouble is, it's hard for the world to see how this comes to an end, because the atrocities committed on the 7th of October, I don't buy a newspaper anymore. I get it downloaded on my phone, right? So on last Sunday, get the Sunday Times coming through onto my phone. And I don't know if any of you read it. I don't actually think it's a good idea to read it. It was the most harrowing, most shocking account yet of what happened on October the 7th that I've ever could possibly imagine. It's beyond belief what Hamas terrorists did when they went into Israel. It was, I'm not even going to begin to try and describe it because I don't want to. I've got images in my head now, unfortunately, planted there from the words that were written, that have all been corroborated. And such was the horror on that day. And bearing in mind, of course, that day was exactly 50 years after the last big war, the Yom Kippur War. It's 50 years almost to the day that Hamas launched this war. It was on the very last day of the Jewish Feast of Tabernacles. All these are significant time frames and significant dates, and suddenly exploding into Israel was horror unimaginable. And therefore, Benjamin Netanyahu has formed an emergency government and is underway to rid the Gaza area of Hamas. And he's still saying that even as of today, despite growing pressure to stop from certain nations. There's elections bubbling away, aren't there? With Biden wants to try and get into power next year. Our own Prime Minister of this country, there's elections coming up next year. So there's all politics that play into this as well. But this was Benjamin Netanyahu. Let's see if if the audio works here. This is what he said pretty much after, straight after the 7th of October attacks.
Israel is at war. We didn't want this war. It was forced upon us in the most brutal and savage way. But though Israel didn't start this war, Israel will finish it. Once the Jewish people were stateless. Once the Jewish people were defenseless. No longer. Hamas will understand that by attacking us, they've made a mistake of historic proportions. We will exact a price that will be remembered by them and Israel's other enemies for decades to come. The savage attacks that Hamas perpetrated against innocent Israelis are mind-boggling, slaughtering families in their homes, massacring hundreds of young people at an outdoor festival, kidnapping scores of women, children, and elderly, even Holocaust survivors. Hamas terrorists bound, burned, and executed children. They are savages. Hamas is ISIS. And just as the forces of civilizations united to defeat ISIS, the forces of civilization must support Israel in defeating Hamas.
Defeating Hamas. This is number one on the agenda, and the vast majority of people living in Israel support this. They don't necessarily support Benjamin Netanyahu as a politician, I must say, but they support what Israel is trying to do to bring Hamas to a complete and utter end. Now then, why this is sort of interesting is that for some time, for those of you who've received the weekly World Watch, and maybe you've seen it yourself, I've been saying that I think with Bible in hand, and look, I might be wrong on this, right? Because we all look through a glass darkly, aren't we? We're trying to fit together many, many hundreds, if not thousands of verses, and all these intricacies of prophecy. They're not all neatly put in one chapter that read like a storybook. We've got to piece things together. But having done the World Watch for such a long time and looking at it every single week for 20 years, gradually forming in my mind, looking at the verses, was this picture that was saying to me that there is going to be an inner ring war around Israel. And I'm just going to cover this very briefly, okay? So, with Bible in hand, I genuinely do think that there is an initial inner ring war around Israel that involves Israel's immediate neighbors. So I'm not jumping on the back of the events that have happened in the last few days. You can go back probably almost 15 years and look at World Watch slides that say exactly this, that this is what we should potentially be looking for. A regional conflict that involves the surrounding peoples of Israel, namely the Palestinians and Hamas and Hezbollah and Syria and so on. So this conflagration that we're seeing immediately around Israel, I think is really, really significant. What I think is going to happen, I'm going to throw some verses in to sort of back this up, but I think Israel wins this war with their immediate enemies. Israel will be victorious, although left weakened, right? And I'm going to show you why I think that. In amongst this great conflict that comes with the surrounding peoples of Israel. I've put a bit of an abyss there. That's what that black hole is. That's a bit of an abyss. Because our whole abyss is going to open up at this time in the territory of the ancient king of the north, which is Syria. We're told, as we're going to look at in a minute, that Damascus is going to cease to be a city. And I think it all happens during this initial inner ring war, and Israel comes through, not unscathed, but does come through victorious. And at this time, there is a temporary time of peace. A time that we're going to look at that says that the walls and the gates and the bars end up coming down. Israel is sort of at peace, relatively. There's never totally true peace, is there? We know that. But they've got a sort of false sense of security. Now, at some point, and I'm going to have to build this up a little bit for you because you're going to think, how is this actually happening? But I actually think that around about this sort of time, and we don't know when, I actually believe that the Lord Jesus Christ is going to appear in the clouds of heaven in power and great glory, and we, along with the rest of the planet, will see this happen. We're going to see Jesus come, but he's then going to disappear, right? He's going to appear in the clouds of heaven for a time, and then he's going to go, because what's happening at that point is that the dead are being raised and are being judged somewhere, right? And the world actually carries on. The world carries on for a period of time. I'll cover this in a bit more detail in a minute. So basically what then happens some time after is that into the void and the peace that's been created, this sort of pseudo peace that's created in Israel, there's an outer ring of nations, an outer circle of nations that come pouring into the void that's there in the Middle East, especially through into Syria and carrying on into Israel, and in fact on into Egypt. Now it's this bit that we as a community of Christadelphians have talked a lot about, and rightly so, because what we're talking about here with the outer circle of nations is in fact the Ezekiel 38 scenario of Russia and Turkey and Iran coming in. But it all happens after the events that I've just spoken about. And in they all flood, and in they all come. And at this point, Israel loses, categorically loses. And in fact, if Christ himself didn't enter the fray with the judged saints at that point, all would be lost forever for Israel. So great would be its destruction. But Christ does come into Jerusalem at that point. And when he comes into Jerusalem at this point, when you read in Zechariah 14, it tells you that he comes with the saints. Now, the only possible way that Jesus could walk into Jerusalem at this point, when all this outer ring of nations have come in, is if the judgment has taken place. Because you don't become a saint and be part of Jesus's army unless that has taken place. So somehow or other, when you look at Zechariah 14, the judgment has already taken place at this point. So let me just give you a few passages. This is really, I'm doing a recap, right, on two talks I've done recently, one called The Inner Ring War and one called The Outer Circle War, that are both on YouTube. And for those who watch this later, my advice is go and watch The Inner Ring War first, watch The Outer Circle War second, and then watch what I'm doing right now third. Now, you haven't got that choice unless you walk out and then run back in a bit. So you're having to have part 3 almost. So I'm really doing a recap. And in those other talks, I go into a lot more detail about this scenario. So here's where I just want to start in terms of a recap. I believe that the Inner Ring War is detailed out in the early verses of Zechariah chapter 12, and that the Outer Circle War is detailed out in Zechariah chapter 14. So I don't know if you want to look at Zechariah chapter 12. And if anybody's interested, I've sort of gone through every single verse and pretty much every single word in Zechariah 12 and 14, and also dealing with chapter 13, clearly, that comes in between. So if you want more of a big in-depth look at it, I'm happy to send that around. So I'm just picking out key points because of time. So in verse 2, we are told that God is going to make Jerusalem, this is a modern version, by the way, yours might say something like reeling, but mine says in this version, I will make Jerusalem like an intoxicating drink that makes the nearby people stagger when they send their armies against to Jerusalem and Judah. The AV says, behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling unto all the people round about. This word round about is really, really important because it means nearby and encircling, which is why I've came up with this concept of an inner ring war. It's nearby people that are encircling, and they send their armies. Now, you notice it talks about it's making the nearby people, it's making them act drunk. In the AV, it says that they are trembling, but the word, if you look in your margin, is reeling, and it's like I'm staggering. That's what it really means. It means I'm intoxicated with alcohol. Now, if you look at what happens, I think we all probably know at some point in our lives what it's like to have too much alcohol, but these people are absolutely intoxicated by Jerusalem. And we see the streets of the UK and around the world on a Friday night, or probably most nights nowadays, where people have had too much drink and there's violence and morals collapse to the floor. And this is what impacts the nearby people. They act as if in a frenzied, violent, immoral way. And Hamas and what they did on October the 7th couldn't be a better description of people intoxicated with rage and hatred, immorality, and so on, and violence. All the things that alcohol can do. And God says it's the nearby people that are going to be impacted like that. They absolutely act in a frenzy. Moving on to verse 6, it says, on that day, I will make the clans of Judah, and in your version it might say the governors of Judah. Some versions say the leaders of Judah. So these are the leaders of Israel. I will make the leaders of Israel, the governors of Judah, like a flame that sets a wood pile ablaze, or like a burning torch among the sheaves of grain. So in other words, the leaders of Jerusalem are like a match, like a spark. Right? They're like a flame themselves. And what do they do with the flame? It says they will burn up all the neighboring people right and left, while the people living in Jerusalem remain secure. So the leaders of Jerusalem, the leaders of Judah are going to ignite themselves, make a flame, and then they're going to use that flame to devour the nearby people, while Jerusalem remains secure. The AV doesn't quite put it like that. It says at the end of verse 6, it says, and Jerusalem shall be inhabited again in her own place, even in Jerusalem, which is a slightly confusing translation. What does it mean? Jerusalem shall be inhabited again in her own place, even in Jerusalem. Almost all modern translations put it much, much better, that Jerusalem remains intact, or Jerusalem remains secure, because that is the meaning of the Hebrew. So notice, nearby people, lots of destruction coming from the rulers of Judah that burn up the neighboring people right and left, and Jerusalem survives. But when you look at the outer circle side of things, which is Zechariah 14, it's not the same. We're not talking anymore about nearby people or surrounding people or people round about. In fact, God switches from using the word people to using the word nations. He switches from using the word people to using the word nations. And in Zechariah 14, we no longer read about people, we read about nations, totally different Hebrew word. I will gather all the nations to fight against Jerusalem. Now look what happens to Jerusalem. The city will be taken, the houses looted, the women raped, half the population will be taken into captivity, and the rest will be left among the ruins of the city. You're going to flee. And then the Lord, my God, will come and all his saints with him. And we know that this is actually ultimately a reference to Jesus being here as God's representative here back on earth. Jesus arrives at this point when the outer circle have come in. So what I'm saying is that what you've got here is nearby people attacked, but Jerusalem survives. And on the right, we've got all nations attacking, and this time Jerusalem is ruined. How can they be the same event? I don't think they are. One's the inner ring, the other's the outer circle. Now, what this doesn't tell you is who exactly is involved, does it? Because it says nearby and surrounding, but who are these people? And I actually think in Psalm 83 that we're given who the people are. This is a psalm written by a seer called Asaph. A seer was a prophet. And so this is a prophet that's written Psalm 83 called Asaph. And he says some amazing words, because he basically says, keep not thou silence, O God, hold not thy peace, be not still, O God. For lo, thine enemies make a tumult. They that hate thee have lifted up the head. They've taken crafty counsel against your people, consulted against your hidden ones. They have said, come, let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. They've all consulted together with one consent. They're confederate against thee. The tabernacle, so here, this is the list now. Verses 6 to 8 is the list. The tabernacles of Edom, the Ishmaelites of Moab, the Hagarenes, Gebal, Ammon, Amalek, the Philistines, with the inhabitants of Tyre. Asher also is joined with them. So you got like this list, and then, by the way, there's Asher that's also joining with this little lot. And when you add it up, there's 9 tribes that are mentioned, and there's one nation, and it's that Asher that's a nation that's mentioned, that's supporting and backing these 9 tribes. So, first thing to note is, look, that there's a group, they all get together and they want to destroy Israel. So this makes me think, wait a minute, these sound like nearby people, and it sounds like they're trying to destroy Israel. And when I went and put them on a map, this is what it looked like. And we haven't got time to go into each one and who they all are, but suffice to say, all of them surround Israel, and entirely, completely surround Israel, right up against its borders. Every last one of them. There isn't, in fact, a single one of them that's away from Israel's border. Not one of them. There's not one that's in the distance. All of them completely surround Israel. So you've got the inhabitants of Tyre up there in Lebanon, and Gebal is up there in Lebanon, and the Philistines down there in modern day, what we'd now call Gaza, and Moab and Ammon and Edom. They're all surrounding. All of them are surrounding. Now, one thing that it said was that they sort of all come together and form a confederacy to try to destroy Israel. So have a little look at this.
A very telling picture just released, a meeting in Beirut, Lebanon, between a top Hamas official, the leader of another militant group, and the head of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah. Behind them, pictures of past and present leaders of their benefactor, Iran. Here's what Benny Gantz in Israel's war cabinet said about the fight with Hezbollah.
The IDF had a thick and very strong shield along the entire northern border on all its fronts. There are significant casualties to Hezbollah. I suggest to our enemy not to get confused. Our power is tremendous, ready to launch, and they better beware.
Okay, so it's the same message to Hezbollah as it is to Hamas. You better beware, we will come and destroy you. If you dare to attack us, and at the minute Hezbollah are launching attacks almost on a daily basis against Israel, but it hasn't ratcheted up yet. But the whole world's on tenterhooks, believing that at some point, if this keeps going on, that they're going to get involved. Psalm 83 says to me that they will. Now, some have said, well, maybe Psalm 83 is ancient history, or maybe it was even fulfilled in 1967, or maybe 1973. Why do we think Psalm 83 is even still outstanding? And there's two reasons that it is still outstanding. The main reason is this, that the second half of Psalm 83 tells you that the enemies of Israel are going to be destroyed utterly and completely, and it gives 6 examples of how they're going to be destroyed. And the first on the list is destroy them like Sisera was destroyed. Now, anybody that wants to go and look at Sisera, this guy came to a very nasty end, because a lady called Jael, while he was asleep, got a tent peg and smashed it through his temples into the ground. That's not a pleasant way to go, and you're completely dead if that happens to you. And out of all the examples that God could have picked in Psalm 83 to explain the end of these enemies of Israel, that's the first on the list. And there are 6 other people well, 5 other people as well as Sisera in Psalm 83 that we haven't got time to look at, but go and look at them. And you'll find that every one of them appears in Judges 4, 5, and 6, and every one of them is destroyed. And the very fact, therefore, that Israel still has enemies that surround them that are conspiring to destroy them is proof enough that Psalm 83 has not yet been fulfilled. The other thing is, at the end of Psalm 83, it says that all men will know that Yahweh God exists. And I don't think we can say that in the world right now. The conclusion of Psalm 83 is that the whole world recognizes God. We've never had that stage. Psalm 83 is still outstanding. The other passage that's worth thinking about is Isaiah chapter 17, which talks about the same event. It's the inner ring war. And when it says Asher is joined with those 9 tribes that surround Israel, Asher is another name for Syria, and maybe wider across into Iraq, even into potentially northern Iran, because Asher was a huge area, but it definitely covered Syria. And we know that Syria is technically at war with Israel even now, and also wants the destruction of Israel. But what we're told in Isaiah 17 is that Damascus is going to be removed from being a city and become a fallen ruin. In fact, if you go and look in Jeremiah 49, it tells you that all the men of war in Damascus will be killed in one single day. Such will be the destruction that comes on the capital city of Syria, Damascus. And the funny thing, well, it's not funny, but the point is, Damascus has never, in all its history, come to a complete end ever. So this also is outstanding. And somehow it's got to fit in to the puzzle. Otherwise, God has told us something that is meaningless. So it's got to happen. It's when it happens is the question. And my belief is it's in amongst the inner ring war around Israel. Notice it also says in the same chapter that the 45 towns of northern Israel will also be destroyed, and the royal power of Damascus will end, and Israel's glory will grow dim in that day. This is why I say Israel survives, but is weakened, especially in the north. Okay, happy so far? Right, now the other interesting thing is that in Zechariah chapter 12, in a few verses after the ones that we've just looked at, we've got this rather remarkable thing where you've got, seems to me, like the appearance of Jesus, because it says that they, talking about the Jews living in Israel, will look on me whom they have pierced and mourn for him as for an only son. So this says to me that this has got to be the return of Jesus. Because at the minute they don't look at Jesus. I mean, none of us look at Jesus, whom we can't see him. But we know there's a point when he will come and he will be seen. And therefore, there is this scenario that is taking place in the same chapter in Zechariah 12. Interestingly, in Isaiah 17, which is the chapter that talks about the destruction of Damascus, we've got a sort of a similar message. It says, when Damascus is destroyed, in that day people will look to their Maker and turn their eyes to the Holy One of Israel. So again, there's something in the middle of Isaiah 17 that says people are suddenly recognizing that there is a creator or a maker. So you might not believe this, and I'm not saying that, I'm not being categorical on any of these things. And I know some people will think, well, Jesus is going to come as a thief, which means nobody will know he's here, and he could be here now and judging the dead, and nobody's aware of it. And some do believe that. I personally don't. I think when Jesus comes, we'll all know about it. And Revelation 1 verse 7 says, behold, Jesus comes with clouds, and every eye shall see him, and they also which pierced him. Direct quote from Zechariah chapter 12. All the kindreds of the earth shall wail because of him. So I think Jesus isn't coming back as a secret squirrel and nobody knows he's there. This time he's coming back and everybody's going to know that he's back. Now, what it actually looks like, I don't 100% know, because imagine Jesus is up in the heavens somewhere. If I put one of you up in the sky, it wouldn't take too long for you to be so small, I couldn't really see you. You haven't got to be that far away, have you, to not be seen? But here's the thing, Jesus, when he comes back, is not coming back as one individual person. He's going to come back and the heaven will be emptied of the millions and millions of angels that are currently in heaven, and we know some working on earth. Jesus isn't coming back on his own. The angels will be with him. And what that looks like in heaven, I do not know. It might be some bright light. I don't know what it's going to look like. It's impossible for us to know. But somehow or other, we will know that this is what it is. And some have said, well, everybody will see Jesus now because we've all got these. And I don't think we need these to see Jesus coming back. Because every night we see the moon in the sky, and it doesn't matter if you're in Australia or here, you'll see at some point the moon in the sky. And if there is somehow something so wondrous and large in the heavens, it's only got to be there 24 hours and the world spins once and everybody will see him regardless of a mobile phone. God doesn't need us to have mobile phones for this event. Now, we then scurry on and we think about Ezekiel 38 very, very briefly, because this is part 2. This is Zechariah 14. This is the outer circle of nations that come in. And I'm not going to read through all of this. I'm presuming all of you know Ezekiel 38 pretty well. And we're told here, not about 9 tribes plus a nation that come in against Israel. This is different. We've now got 9 nations that come in against Israel. We've got Magog, Meshech, Tubal, Rosh. We've got Persia, Ethiopia, Libya. We've got Gomer, Togarmah, all of them coming in against Israel. It's a different conflict. And just as Zechariah 12 points to Psalm 83 to give you the nation detail or the people detail, so Zechariah 14 points to Ezekiel 38 to give us the nation detail. And if you put all of these nations on a map, this is what it looks like. Again, this is what I've looked at and the way I see it, and you might see it different. But this is how I see it. You'll notice I haven't coloured really anything in of Europe on this conflict because I don't think Europe's involved in this conflict. The outer circle nation, I think, is predominantly Russia. Magog, Meshech, Tubal, Rosh is Russia. Togarmah and Gomer is the Caucasus region and the whole of Turkey. Persia is Iran. Libya is Libya and maybe a little bit over to Algeria. Egypt's not included. And Ethiopia is actually mainly northern Sudan when you look at it. But those are the nations that come in Ezekiel 38. And you'll notice not a single one of them touch Israel. That's why this is an outer circle war that comes after the initial inner ring war has happened. Now, this is the power block. This is the main power block here. You've got Turkey, Iran, and Russia. These guys are all the major force, headed up by the man himself at the moment, President Vladimir Putin. Have a look at this.
Meanwhile, the man responsible for the war, Russia's President Vladimir Putin, has traveled to Iran. This is only his second trip abroad since the conflict began. In Tehran, he held talks with regional heavyweights, Iran and Turkey. As his country begins to feel the impact of international isolation and the costly campaign in Ukraine, Putin is looking for allies. Iran has long been the target of Western sanctions, so Moscow hopes to develop closer military and economic ties. The Tehran trip also offers Putin a chance for a face-to-face meeting with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Turkey.
There you go, all coming together exactly like the Bible says. It's amazingly accurate what is happening here. So look, what we're saying is there's this initial inner ring war, great conflagration around Israel. This could be underway right now with what we're seeing. Israel is going to win and survive or be left weakened. But here is something amazing. And I don't know whether you've read it like this before, but in the middle of Ezekiel 38 and in verse 8, in a slightly modern version, it says this. A long time from now, I've put in the outer circle, right, because I've been cheeky. But a long time from now, you, which is really talking about the Russian leader, at the moment it's Putin, will be called into action. In the distant future, you, and this is including all the nations that I've just described, you will swoop down on the land of Israel, which will be enjoying peace after recovering from war. Israel will be enjoying peace after recovering from war. Which war are they recovering from? Is it a war from 1948 or 1967 or 1973? I don't think so. I think Israel is recovering from the war that is underway potentially right now. And it says that you will, after its people have returned from many lands to the mountains of Israel. So God says, look, you'll know when it is because it's after they're back in the land. So that gives us 1948 onwards. You and all your allies, a vast and awesome army, will roll down on them like a storm to cover the land. Now, what it then says is, so there they all are swooping down, and there's the outer ring. Thank you. Lovely. That's good. But what Ezekiel 38 also says, and this is what we're waiting for, it says, this is what the sovereign Lord says. On that day, you Russian ruler, thoughts will come into your mind and you will devise an evil scheme. You will say, I will invade a land of unwalled villages. I will attack a peaceful and unsuspecting people, all of them living without walls and without gates and bars. Now, is that the situation in Israel right now? Living in peace? Without walls and bars and gates? I don't think so. So how do we get to that stage? You get to that stage by only one thing, and that is removing the pricking briars, as Ezekiel 28 calls it, that surround Israel. And that, I believe, could well be underway right now. And I know it seems hard to imagine, why would Russia and all these other enemies of Israel decide to attack Israel when clearly everything's worked out just about okay for Israel? That's a good question, isn't it? Well, we're given part of the answer in Ezekiel 38. It's because Russia wants to take the spoil. That's what it wants. It's all to do with money. It's nothing to do with religion with Russia. It's 100% to do with cash and economics and money and gas and oil, and Israel is extremely lucrative. And bearing in mind, if I'm right, that actually what Israel has only recently just done is destroyed Russia's main ally in the region, Syria, which has seriously upset Russia, and if Putin's still in power, Putin. Israel's just destroyed one of its main allies. And bearing in mind, Russia's got a lot of manpower in Syria. So when Syria goes up, this will really, really, really upset Putin, and machinations will be put in place to come down, and despite the peace, he will come and invade. Okay, now that is a bit of a long recap, right, on talks I've done previously. I'm not going to run through this again. Let's skip forward a little bit, because now I want to do something that I haven't done before, and I'm running past something past you to see what you think about how this might all link to this. Bear with me. We know that. The Olivet Prophecy. So come and have a look at Matthew 24. Okay. So here's Jesus. He sat on the Mount of Olives. He sat with his disciples, and they're looking at the temple and all the buildings of the temple. Now, we call it the Olivet Prophecy, and we know that a good chunk of the Olivet Prophecy is to do with AD 70. But equally, a good chunk of the Olivet Prophecy is not to do with AD 70. It's to do with the time of the end. And if we're right, if I'm right looking with Bible in hand that these events of an inner ring and an outer circle war are going to take place, there's a possibility that it's all there as well inside the Olivet Prophecy, and that's what I want to show you. So don't walk out at this point. Bear with me. Let's have a look and see where we get to. So here's Matthew 24. Now, Matthew 24 starts out with Jesus departing from the temple, and the disciples come to him and to show him these amazing buildings that we just looked at of the temple. And Jesus said to them, "Don't you see all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world," or the end of the age? Now, here's the thing. Some people will say, well, that's not talking about the coming of Jesus, the second coming. And when it says the end of the world, it means the end of the age, and it's all AD 70. And I don't believe that. There is only one coming of the Lord Jesus Christ in its greatest extent. And when the disciples said, "What's the sign of your coming?" they're asking him, when is he going to come? When's he actually going to come back? And when is the end of the age, or the end of the world? And interestingly, Jesus, of course, said, when you look at all the buildings, disciples, and you see the temple and everything that's there and all the buildings, there won't be one stone that isn't thrown down. And amazingly, of course, you could go to Israel, and many of you will have been, I'm sure, and you can go and see that Jesus' words have not been fulfilled. Because the retaining wall that they would have been looking at and would have seen and been part of what was there 2,000 years ago is still there right now. The Wailing Wall itself is exactly the same wall. And when Jesus said not one single stone will be left upon another, he wasn't lying. This is a living, breathing stone testament to the fact there's still more to happen in relation to Matthew 24. Because the stones are still there, and they have not moved, and it's where many, many, many thousands go every day to pray. Now, Matthew 24, verses 4 to 7 says, "Take heed that no man deceive you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many, and you'll hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, for the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There's going to be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places. So Jesus is saying to the disciples, look, there's going to be a whole bunch of history in front of you here that involves nations and kingdoms and pestilences and famines and earthquakes, all these things. Because he says, look, the end is not yet. The end is in the future some point, disciples. There's a lot of history that's got to flow along before we get to the end. Now, in Matthew 24, verse 8, it says, Jesus says, that these are the beginning of sorrows. So verse 8 says, these are the beginning of sorrows. But Luke 21 doesn't say that. It's got a completely different perspective. Having said the same sort of words, Luke then says, but before all of this, I'm now going to tell you some events that are going to happen. And what happens in Luke 21, which we haven't got time to look at in any detail, is that Luke goes back through the words of Jesus to look at events leading up to AD 70. Matthew doesn't. He springboards straight past AD 70 and he goes right to the very, very end. This is what it's like. Luke 21 is coming up to AD 70. Matthew 24 is dealing about the end. Now I'm going to prove this to you. I can easily prove this to you. Verse 9 says this in Matthew 24. Speaking of faithful believers, Jesus says that you will be hated of all nations. In verse 13, he says, he that shall endure to the end shall be saved. In verse 14, Jesus speaks of the gospel being preached in all the world and to all nations. And in verse 14, he then concludes this little bit and then says, then shall the end come. Right? Not one of those phrases appears in Luke. Not a single one of those phrases. Luke 21 is not about the time of the end. It eventually does catch up, right? But the vast majority of Luke 21 is leading up to AD 70. Matthew springs straight past AD 70, and everything is about the end. The end, the end, the end. And guess where we are? The end. Guess what AD 70 wasn't? The end. We are at the end. So if you have a look in Matthew 24, you'll see what we've covered of the first 14 verses. And there you are, look at the end of verse 14. The gospel of the kingdom should be preached in all the world. It had not been preached in all the world in AD 70. It hadn't even really got going. The gospel hadn't gone very far in AD 70. Jesus says the gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world for witness to all nations, and then the end will come. Right? So we're now at the end, and now what he does is tells us about what's going to happen at the end. And what he says is going to happen is, he says, when you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso reads, let him understand, then let them which be in Judea flee to the mountains, let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house, neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe to those that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days, but pray that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. Now look, for then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. Oh, okay, this is interesting. So there's a sign of an abomination, of desolation, that stands on the holy place, which is in Jerusalem, and that's a great sign to flee. And then there's this tribulation that's so bad, it's never to be repeated again, ever. Now, AD 70 was bad. I'm not saying it wasn't. But was it the time of a tribulation, as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be? Is the time of trouble coming down the track, do we think, that's going to engulf the entire planet less than what happened in AD 70? And the answer, of course, is no. As bad as AD 70 was, it is the tribulation coming to this earth is astronomically more. And it doesn't need a rocket scientist to see where Jesus is quoting anyway from there, because he is quoting, surprise, surprise, from Daniel chapter 12, verse 1, where Daniel writes, there'll be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, and then at that time people will be delivered, some to everlasting life and so on. Jesus is referencing that. The time of trouble is at the end, and therefore the sign is at the end. In Daniel chapter 12, verse 11, it tells us about the abomination that makes desolate being set up. I mean, what's this talking about? Something's happening at the very end. There's an abomination being set up. In Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, it talks about somebody making an agreement with many for 1/7, and in the middle of the 7, he puts an end to sacrifice and offering, and at the temple he will set up an abomination that causes desolation. And Jesus says, go and read Daniel, because he'll tell you what the abomination of desolation is that I'm telling you is the sign about the time of the end. I tell you, it's a very different sign to Luke 21, because when you go to Luke 21, which we know is the parallel passage to Matthew 24, what I'm suggesting is its focus is on AD 70. What I'm saying is Matthew 24 is focuses on the time of the end. Look at what the sign is in Luke 21. When you will see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know the desolation thereof is nigh. Then flee to the mountains, then get out, because not that this is the time of tribulation such as never was. No, it's a different phrase, look. These are the days of vengeance. You need to flee because they're days of vengeance. It's not the time of trouble such as never was. This is the days of vengeance. It's not an abomination standing on the holy place. It is Jerusalem being surrounded by armies. Now you might say, how is it that that's a very good sign from Jesus? How is it that the sign in AD 70 was when Jerusalem surrounded, then make a run for it? Because that doesn't sound like good advice to me, because surely it's too late. But here is what happened.
To the west, Roman Emperor Nero received word of the revolt in Judea whilst on a concert tour of Greece. Requiring a competent general to take charge and crush the insurrection, Nero appointed a veteran of the British campaign, Titus Flavius Vespasianus, otherwise known as Vespasian, to command the army of Judea. Content to leave Jerusalem to its internal squabbling, the Roman general marched across the mountainous province of Perea and Judea proper, taking almost every settlement of note one by one, laying waste to the countryside and slaughtering tens of thousands of civilians. The campaigning season of 69 AD began similarly. Dispatching his subordinates to the peripheral regions, Vespasian marched on Jerusalem itself. He established garrisons in the towns that anchored his supply lines to the coast, while the Roman horsemen rode down and destroyed any remaining hostile units in the vicinity of Jerusalem. It seemed like only a miracle could save the rebels from Vespasian's wrath. They would get one very soon. Nero was forced to commit suicide. With the empire suddenly in the process of eating itself alive, the campaign into Judea came to a halt, as Vespasian paused to consider his options. Finally, on July 1st, 69 AD, Vespasian was proclaimed Caesar by the prefect of Egypt in the presence of his legions.
So what happened was Vespasian suddenly is promoted to emperor, and having surrounded Jerusalem with many soldiers, decided that he was going to go back to Rome and be crowned as emperor. So he scootles back, and all the armies around Jerusalem suddenly melted away and disappeared. Jesus said, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then flee. So suddenly there's a break. There's about a 10-month break in the conflict that happened in AD 70. And during that little window was the window that they were supposed to escape. And many didn't, because this is what happened next.
Titus began the Jerusalem campaign in spring of 70 AD. The army assembled there was even larger than that commanded by Vespasian in the previous years. The slaughter during the fall of Jerusalem supposedly resulted in the death of at least hundreds of thousands of civilians, pilgrims, and soldiers. Titus returned to Rome, where his father Vespasian, now the Roman emperor after his victory in 70 AD, granted him a triumph. The Arch of Titus was also dedicated to him, which remains to this day.
And it does. So look, here's a little summary of what happened in AD 70. Jerusalem was originally surrounded by armies by Vespasian. Vespasian clears off. There is a pause in the fighting. There's now a time, according to Jesus, if you're listening to me, to flee out of the land. Some did, many didn't. Then Jerusalem surrounded by much greater armies, you just heard, under Titus, and now Jerusalem is destroyed. Now, what I'm suggesting is that at the time of the end, it's a similar sort of pattern that happens again. Jerusalem is surrounded by nearby enemies who want to destroy Israel. Israel do destroy them, and it's a temporary time of peace, a time to flee. It's about this sort of time that the abomination of desolation gets involved and stands on the holy place. But then after that, Jerusalem is surrounded by even greater armies. This is the outer ring war now. And this time Jerusalem is destroyed. The same pattern of AD 70 is about to happen again, just slightly differently. It's not 100% the same, but it's similar, which is why Jesus connects them all in the Mount of Olives. So the two signs that we've just looked at, Luke 21 is the AD 70 sign of Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, therefore escape. Matthew 24, the time of the end sign, is an abomination that stands on the holy place, and this probably comes during the time of peace. Just this little window of maybe a few years, that's all, in between Israel defeating the enemies and the Gogan invasion. So if I put this on the screen like this, look, there's AD 70, Jerusalem surrounded, remains intact. Armies leave, Vespasian clears off, there's time to escape, and then Titus, who's actually his son, comes back with a much larger army, and now Jerusalem is destroyed. Time of the end. Jerusalem is surrounded, but remains intact. This is the inner ring war, maybe underway. The armies don't leave in as much as the armies are defeated in this case, because Israel removes the pricking briars. Then, according to Jesus, there is a time to escape before the new larger army comes in, which is headed up by Russia. This is the outer circle war, and basically some point in amongst this, and I don't 100% know where exactly, but at some point Daniel 9 verse 27 and other places tell us, and Jesus tells us, something's going to arrive in Jerusalem as an abomination standing in the holy place. And that's the sign to get out of Israel. Now, what Matthew then goes on and says in verse 27, and we've pretty much covered all the verses in between, for as lightning coming out of the east and shining unto the west, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. So about this sort of time, Jesus says, I'm actually going to appear, not quietly, but like lightning. And he says immediately after the tribulation of those days, it really should say immediately with the tribulation of those days. It's all happening at the same time, by the way. When it says immediately after, it's confused a lot of people, because that word after is almost every single solitary time in the Greek translated with. It's all happening at the same time. It's a time of tribulation that is going on all the way through this period. And it says the sun will be dark and the moon won't give her light and so on. But notice what it says in verse 30. It says, then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven. Now, people have written books on what is the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Whole books written on it. And lo and behold, you don't have to write a whole book, because we're told what the sign of the Son of Man in heaven is. It is the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven. The sign in the heavens is Jesus himself in the clouds of heaven with the millions of angels that we've already looked at. If you think Jesus is coming surreptitiously, the clue is in what he says there. Just as lightning comes out of the east and shines unto the west. And this is what lightning looks like that's coming from the east. Well, it isn't, because it's not playing. Hold on, let's do it again. Here we go. This is lightning shining from the east to the west. That isn't Jesus, hiding. It's all going to be seen. And we also are going to see it. So look, we believe, I certainly do, that we're going to see Jesus coming, and it all comes after this event that we're taught, that's been spoken about in relation to this man, whoever it is, standing in the holy place. The final bit of the puzzle, of course, at the end of Matthew 24, is that Jesus sends his angels with a great sound of a trumpet to gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. And this is what I think it's going to sound like. It's going to sound a lot better than this, right? But this is what I think is going to be blown in the heavens. It's the shofar trumpet. When Jesus comes, he is not coming as gentle Jesus, meek and mild this time. He's not hidden in a stable where nobody knows where he is. He's not coming back as he is coming back as a thief, but the thief-like aspect of Christ coming back is the suddenness and unexpectedness, not the quietness. It's the suddenness and the unexpected. That's why he doesn't come like a thief to us, because we're looking up, because our redemption draws nigh. And I think we will hear something like we've just heard, and see something like I've shown you on the screen, and at that point the dead are raised, and the judgment will take place somewhere. I don't 100% know where, but the judgment will start taking place. But we who are alive and remain wait to be collected by the angels. There's a gap in time before we're collected. We're not taken instantly. We live through some of the time of tribulation, but not all of it. We will be rescued. Just as before Sodom and Gomorrah went up in flames, the angels were sent to go and collect them, weren't they? The same will happen with us. The angels will come and collect us. So look, here's the last few slides. There's an inner ring war. Could be underway, couldn't it? Right now, all the signs are that this could be the beginning of it, and it could rumble on and get worse and worse and worse. It could take weeks, months, years, who knows? It could even all die down, and it's another time in the future, couldn't it? But all the gut feeling is amongst the whole world that this is serious, something different, and the inner ring war could be underway. A great, great conflagration underway, even as we speak. Israel defeats the surrounding enemies, Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinians that are fighting against them, even Syria. Islamic Jihad, and all of them that are trying to destroy Israel. There's a great conflict that Syria gets involved in at the same time and is destroyed. We then, at some point during this time, Jesus appears for some short time in the heavens, the trumpet's blown, the dead are raised, then he disappears, and the world, believe it or not, carries on. It doesn't just stop. There's some sort of peace treaty that I think is going to happen, because the peace that comes in Israel, I think the abomination that causes desolation, that we haven't got time to look at tonight, it's another talk for another time, but there's something to do with an agreement that's been made with Israel and the surrounding nations that God is not happy about at all. Because here's the million-dollar question. Why is it that God sends in the armies against Israel after the peace? Why does he do that? Because God puts hooks in the jaws into Russia and brings them down, and God has never done that once without a reason. He didn't just bring armies into Israel because of the heck of it. He's doing it because Israel has done something to warrant it. And what they've done to warrant it is something to do with the abomination of desolation and an agreement in Daniel 9:27. That's what I think is going to happen. And it's at that time the people need to flee. And if they don't flee, they're going to get caught up in the outer circle war that is coming against Israel when all is lost. But it isn't all lost, because at this point in time, Jesus himself comes onto the scene physically now, up to and into the east gate of Jerusalem, whatever's left of it, and he comes with the saints. The judgment has taken place. And at this point, I think we, by that point, have been gathered as well to be with him. So hopefully that was a bit of food for thought. I know you're thinking, well, what's the abomination of desolation and how does all that work? And what's Daniel 9:27 got to do with anything? That's another talk for another day. You'll be glad to know. Thank you for listening.
Well, I'm sure you'd like me to thank Brother Andy for coming across and his work tonight. I'm going to make him a nice cup of tea in a minute to on that. How many online do we have, Mark? We have 100. Oh, right. So thank you all who've come online as well. 100 online, and there's a good number in the hall here. So it's been a successful evening. Announcements on Sunday at our Breaking of Bread. Brother Luke Foley from Coventry West is going to give the exhortation. At our Bible class next Wednesday, Brother Steve James from Evesham is the speaker. His subject will be announced in due course. We'd like you to stop for refreshments. There are some refreshments out the back. Also, just another thing, coming up on Sunday the 17th at 4 o'clock, we're having a carol service. If you're very welcome to come to that as well, and there are invitations in the entrance hall there if you'd like more details on that. So I'm going to close in prayer and also give thanks for the refreshments, if you'll all stand. Now, Lord, as we close this meeting, go with us, keep us safe and free from danger, knowing that our walk is not a lonely one. Be with us on our journey, that we might keep to the narrow path that leads to life, that we might have a place in that glorious kingdom that will finally start to rid this world of sin, and a reign of peace will begin. And children will be able to play in safety, and pain and sorrow will be no more. We also give thanks for the refreshments that have been provided from your bountiful hand. We ask that the strength we get from these may be used doing things that please you. So, Lord, forgive us our sins and help us to be more like your Son, Jesus. This prayer we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Right, okay, thank you very much. Refreshments, of course, will be served in the rear hall.